This is a pink Spitfire, and this is a blue Spitfire. But what exactly is their significance? Well, you'll be pleased to know that it isn't some weird aeronautical gender reveal practice, although if you are going to do a gender reveal, you might as well pick a Spitfire to do it. It's actually a form of camouflage. Hello and welcome back. I'm Christopher Rex Emerson, and today I'm answering the question, why pink Spitfire? Now, a few of you may have seen the occasional picture of these. However, I'd assume that most probably don't know much about the pink Spitfires or why they were even a thing in the first place. Although it might sound a bit ridiculous to say so, the decision to paint some Spitfires pink was actually a tactical one, because it was a form of camouflage. Which means we need to very quickly delve into the fun topic of camouflage, or in the case of making scale model aircraft, the heated topic of camouflage if you've ever looked at a paint color conversion chart, because oh my goodness, those things are not fun to work with. In general terms, the application of military camouflage is to use any sort of combination of materials, colors, and light sources to make you or your equipment or vehicles harder to see, or alternatively to disguise it as something else. Military camouflage has been used for centuries, but the sort of camouflage that we most commonly think about today usually evolved in the early 20th century. Development began during the First World War, and camouflage evolved rapidly during the Second World War. Now, there are all sorts of different types of camouflage that you can use, but we're going to be putting all of those aside today and just focus on the one that matters, and that is camouflage patterns. Most aircraft of the military air forces of the Second World War would have a camouflage pattern that used a combination of disruptive patterns and something called countershading. In most cases, you would see the use of disruptive patterns when painting the upper side of the aircraft. Take, for example, the Hawker Hurricane. Now, a disruptive pattern is a strongly contrasting pattern using non-repeated markings. In a lot of RAF aircraft, this was painted on in a wave-type pattern, like you can see here. But with other nations, such as with Germany, they often had a lot of angular patterns, and they also made a lot of use of dots and stripes. The overall goal of the disruptive pattern was to make the aircraft more difficult to observe from above. It was designed to break up its silhouette and to blend in with the varied textures of the terrain it was matching below. So with the Hawker Hurricane, this is designed to blend in more so when it is flying over, the countryside of England or Central Europe. A lot of people might not understand how effective this is because most photos we see of aircraft flying around with these markings are usually at air shows, and we have a close-up view of the plane highlighted against a very pale background, and you're thinking, well, that camouflage doesn't look very good, does it? But in more real combat scenarios, fighting at the altitudes that most of these fighters fought in the Second World War, over the terrain the camouflage is designed for, of course, these were quite effective at making the aircraft more difficult to see from above. Moving on to counter shading, this is applied to both the upper and lower sides of the aircraft. On the upper sides, it's painted on in darker ground colors like green or brown to match the earth for observers looking down. This is a form of counter shading. The disruptive color pattern is the pattern itself, but the shade design is known as the counter shading. Anyway, I digress. On the undersides, you usually have the aircraft painted in lighter sky colors, such as azure blue, light grey, dark egg green, or even just plain white, to match the sky from observers looking from the ground. There are, of course, some specialized exceptions. Night fighters were often painted entirely in black or in mostly black to blend into the sky. And another specialized exception was the reconnaissance aircraft, and this is where our interestingly painted Spitfires come in. Throughout the duration of the Second World War, the Supermarine Spitfire was an excellent fighter aircraft, and because of its high performance, it was soon utilized as a high-speed single-seat reconnaissance plane. It became so good at this role that it led to the development of several dedicated photo reconnaissance variants of the Supermarine Spitfire, and these are known as the PR marks. These were unarmed, high-speed variants of the Spitfire that were equipped with specialist cameras depending on the particular mission profile. For low altitude, high speed reconnaissance, they tended to be equipped with oblique facing cameras, so cameras facing out to the side. The Spitfire would fly along at a low altitude with its wings tilted a little bit towards the target, and the pilot would time when to take the camera. I will be doing an entire video on that because that is a lot harder than it sounds. Other Spitfires were geared towards high altitude reconnaissance, and they usually had cameras installed in a vertical position within the fuselage. For the high altitude missions, the Spitfires were often painted blue, because they were operating at altitudes of 30,000 feet or even 40,000 feet, and this colour allowed them to blend into the deep blue of the upper atmosphere. Okay, fair enough, that sounds quite reasonable, but how on earth is pink useful? I mean, it's fairly conspicuous. You would see a pink Spitfire coming from miles away. Except under some rather fortuitous conditions. The pink Spitfire was painted that way because it was very effective for a very specific mission, flown at a specific altitude, at a specific time, and with very specific weather conditions. And that was the very, very ballsy mission of high-speed, incredibly low-altitude reconnaissance over heavily defended enemy positions. Early in the war, the photo reconnaissance units of the Royal Air Force enjoyed relative flexibility and freedom when it came to painting their aircraft, unlike the rest of the RAF, which had mandated strict camouflage schemes. Photo reconnaissance units were initially allowed to have their planes coloured in accordance with operational requirements, and this allowed for a lot of experimentation early on to figure out which was the best colours for planes for certain missions. Obviously, the goal was to make the Spitfire as hard to spot during its specific mission as possible. A, because you don't want the enemy knowing you're taking photos of the positions, and B, because the Spitfire is unarmed and flying solo, its only defense is speed and stealth. A Spitfire that is harder to see is undoubtedly going to be one that will have a higher survival rate. As it would turn out, the pink Spitfire would become very effective at helping to keep its pilot alive. The pink Spitfires were painted and configured for low-altitude reconnaissance missions which would take place during dawn and dusk, and the paint scheme that they used was officially known as Camo Tint Pink. It was not, however, the first time that this sort of paint scheme was used. It had its origins in the Royal Navy, and they used a similar shade that was used under a different name experimentally called Mountbatten Pink. And if that name sounds familiar, that is because it is named after Lord Mountbatten himself. In 1940, Lord Mountbatten was leading a destroyer flotilla on escort duty. During one of his convoys, he supposedly observed a Union Castle ship disappearing from view near the horizon earlier than the others, and this was during the dangerous transitional period of the light of dawn or dusk. These particular ships were painted in the Union Castle traditional lavender mauve grey. Mountbatten thought that he would get a tactical advantage if he painted his ships in a similar colour, so he ordered his destroyer flotilla to do so. Was it effective? Anecdotally, many of the sailors and officers who were serving aboard the destroyer flotilla thought the paint scheme was definitely effective. Many would claim that the ships were vanishing against the horizon during dawn and dusk, and there was a particularly famous ship that was painted pink that was HMS Kenya. She was in fact nicknamed the Pink Lady, and she supposedly avoided taking damage from German coastal guns because the pink of her paint scheme confused them because they were using pink dyes in the sighting rounds that they were using when they were trying to shoot the ship. However, in the long run, it was found that the pink colour was not particularly effective. Yes, it had some meritorious effect at dawn and dusk, but it made the ship far more visible during daylight hours compared to those that were painted in the more traditional naval greys. It was also argued that the pink ships were only harder to see during dawn and dusk because the shade of pink itself was merely lighter than the other greys, and testing with ships painted with a grey just as light as the pink yielded some very similar results, so there's that to consider as well. Pink ships were not practical, as it would turn out, but it was quite a different matter when you applied the same colour scheme to an aircraft. For a ship, a single mission could last for days, weeks, or even months. It would be at sea all hours of the day, and the pink paint would only be suitable as a camouflage scheme for 2 or 3 of those hours. An aircraft mission, on the other hand, would be measured in hours. If you time a mission to be over target at dawn and dusk only, the pink camouflage scheme could be very effective. After learning about some of the vaguely flamboyantly painted warships and hearing about their magical disappearing properties, some inventive people from the various photo reconnaissance units of the RAF decided to try painting some of their Spitfires and other reconnaissance planes in this colour, and they were very surprised with the results. And this ended up with pink Spitfires being used in something known as dicing missions. This is a reconnaissance mission that is flown during the conditions of low cloud cover, with the pilots flying the aircraft right at the bottom of the cloud layer, essentially just skimming the bottom just enough so you can see what's going on below. In this mission profile, the pink provided excellent concealment. The lighting conditions of sunrise or sunset allowed the Spitfire to literally melt into the backdrop of the similarly coloured cloud cover. This, combined with the speed that the Spitfire was flying at, made them very difficult for ground defences to spot and track. And the cloud cover also had the additional benefit of further protecting the Spitfire, as it made it very difficult to spot for enemy combat air patrols. Photo reconnaissance Spitfires flying these dicing missions would go on to conduct some of the most dangerous recon missions of the war. Some would be painted pink, and some would be painted white, depending on the time of the day for the mission. One early notable example occurred in 1941 when a Mark 9 PR Spitfire, at an altitude of just 200 feet, took photos of the German radar installation at Brunwald. The clear images that this Spitfire was able to bring back were vital to the successful execution of Operation Biting, which was a commando raid that was later launched against this installation. But the most important work for low-altitude photo reconnaissance Spitfires, particularly the pink ones, were missions during the lead-up to and after D-Day. The winter of 1943 to 44 would see the systematic photographic reconnaissance of the French coastline, and on D-Day itself, despite the appalling weather, the Spitfires conducted recon sorties of key targets at incredibly low altitudes. As a good number of those recon missions were flown at dawn and dusk, it's highly likely that the pink Spitfires would not have been a particularly uncommon sight for people in the Normandy area in the days immediately following D-Day. Though the Spitfires that were painted blue and white were by far the most common, the pink Spitfires were almost always considered the hardest to spot. The camouflage may look a bit silly, but it was the perfect example of what you would call situational camouflage, making you near enough invisible at the right place and at the right time.